The beliefs that we form based on traumatic events are the key to why trauma stays with us. But these beliefs that we form are also the key to finding healing. What story do we tell ourselves about what happened? How did it affect the way we see ourselves or our circumstances? How did it affect our relationship to the people that matter to us? What changes did you notice in your beliefs based on this event? And is there perhaps a way to tell a better story? Processing trauma can be one of the most difficult and painful things a person can go through. It's like opening up an infected wound and cleaning it out. It hurts, but it's a whole lot better in the end. And that's just it. Sometimes the beliefs that we carry from trauma are rational. The world can be dangerous. People can be evil and cruel. Relationships can end very poorly. It's not wrong or foolish to believe these sorts of things, but it's no way to live. Our faith gives us resources to write a better story for ourselves. You feel like you're a broken person because of what happened to you? Well, guess what? God chooses broken people. God works through broken people. God used a man whose body was broken on a cross to mend the brokenness at the heart of human existence. And God's love and grace remind us that we are not what happened to us. We're God's children, chosen and loved. God helps us tell a better story than our trauma wants us to believe. This week we're continuing our series on Christian faith and mental health. And today we're going to be talking about trauma, which is a heavy thing to talk about. So before we get into this, and this disclaimer holds true for every topic that we discuss, but I do want to make sure to state just that it's possible some of the discussion this morning for some of you, depending on what your experiences have been, might bring up some feelings that are unpleasant. So if that's the case for you, I just encourage you to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. If that means stepping out for a few minutes, that's fine. If that means tuning out, that's fine. But I'm not a scientist. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a counselor, but I've done my best this morning to make sure the information that I'm sharing comes from reputable sources, like the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, and the most reputable source of all, my wife, who, and this is true, has never been wrong one time in her life. So, she gets a co-writer credit on this one. So what is trauma? Here's one definition. That trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. Emotional shock following a stressful event or a physical injury, which may lead to long-term complications. That's one way to define it. That's a loose definition. Here's a more specific definition. This comes from the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the DSM-5 that is published by the American Psychiatric Association. They define it as exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, sexual violence in one or more of the following ways. 1, directly experiencing the traumatic event. 2, witnessing in person the event as it occurred to others. 3, learning that the traumatic event occurred to a close family member or close friend. In cases of actual or threatened death of a family member or friend, the event must have been violent or accidental. And the 4th one is experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of traumatic events. For example, first responders collecting human remains, police officers repeatedly exposed to details of child abuse, etc. Now, this is part of the framework that mental health professionals use to diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder. And we'll go ahead and go back to that first definition. But notice the different types of traumatic experiences. Trauma can come from violence, abuse, accidents, or the threat of violence, abuse, or some kind of accident happening to you. It can also come from witnessing something happening to another person. It doesn't have to have directly happened to you in order for it to be traumatic. Even hearing about something happening to a loved one can develop into a traumatic memory. But why do certain experiences traumatize us? What's happening in our minds and our bodies that leads certain memories to affect us in the long term? How does trauma work? Well, the house I grew up in was in the woods. It was in a neighborhood, but it was a really wooded neighborhood. We were on 4 acres. And I can remember one time when I was a teenager, late at night, I was going down our long driveway to get the trash can. It's probably 9 o'clock at night. I had been asked to go get the trash can much earlier, but had put it off until a bit too late. So I was now reaping the rewards of my own unwillingness to do my chores in a timely manner. But I got to the end of the driveway, and my eyes thought they saw something. You know how your eyes will do that in the dark, where you'll think you'll see a person or a shape? Well, that happened to me on the cul-de-sac. I thought I saw somebody out of the corner of my eye. And almost immediately, I had this huge rush of adrenaline. At the same time, I realized there's nobody there. But I was so spooked by that momentary rush that I just couldn't calm my nerves down. And so I knew I was being ridiculous, but I turned and I ran back to the house because that switch had been flipped. And that feeling of fight or flight was so powerful, I just couldn't flip the off switch. All my body could tell me to do was run away. And so I did. And there's a reason for this reaction that our bodies do. It keeps us alive. Right? If you hear something rustling in the tall grass, your brain isn't designed to wait around and see whether it's a lion or not. Because the moment you stand there thinking, well, was that a lion or was that just the wind? The lion's going to jump out and eat you. Our minds are designed to run first or fight first and ask questions later. There are certain instincts that are hardwired into our brains. You've probably known people that if you jumped out and scared them, you'd better also back up right away because that hand is going right straight out at your face. And they don't mean to do that. It's just a reflex. See, that survival instinct is hardwired into our minds. And that threat response can be triggered by all kinds of things. It's something your brain does automatically, and it's not always rational. It's just something that happens. And if a shadow in the night can trigger that fight or flight response, if something that's not even real can send your body into overdrive, what might an actual threat do? And that's the strange thing about trauma. When it happens, our brains don't know what to do with it. You think of a traumatic event like a surge of electricity in your brain. Something happens, that threat response is triggered. You're a soldier in a combat zone. You experience some sort of abuse or you watch it happen to someone else. You encounter the aftermath of a violent event. You get some devastating news about a loved one. And when that happens, it's like a power surge rushing through your brain. Only there's no breaker that trips to stop the flow of electricity. And so that electricity goes wherever it can, and it overloads the grid, and it blows, so to speak. See, trauma overloads our capacity to process what's going on. And it can cause all kinds of strange effects in our minds and in our bodies. So some symptoms of going through trauma, how it affects us. You can have nightmares after something traumatic has happened to you. You may experience triggers. In other words, certain things cause you to relive the event. Another thing our brains are designed for is pattern recognition. And so you smell something or you hear a sound that reminds your brain of the event. And all those emotions come flooding back. Because again, your brain's not going to stop to assess whether that sound or smell actually means you're in danger. It's going to go into overdrive to protect you and ask questions later. That's why people have flashbacks. So you may have sensory things that can trigger you reliving that event. You may want to avoid thinking or talking about what happened to you. You may experience what's called hypervigilance or hyperawareness. This is where you don't feel safe anymore. Maybe loud noises startle you more than they used to. Or when you're in a crowded space, you want to always have your back to a wall so you can see everything. You might have trouble concentrating. It's hard to feel safe or to feel normal in the world. And so you have that hypervigilance. And last one, you might experience changes in your beliefs, negative changes in your beliefs or feelings about yourself or about the world. And depending on what happened, you might no longer have positive or loving feelings towards people that are close to you. You might distance yourself from relationships or find it more difficult to form relationships. You may feel like the world is this completely dangerous place and that no one can be trusted. Now, the beliefs that we form based on traumatic events are the key to why trauma stays with us. But these beliefs that we form are also the key to finding healing from traumatic events. What story do we tell ourselves about what happened? How did it affect the way we see ourselves or our circumstances? How did it affect our relationship to the people that matter to us? What changes did you notice in your beliefs based on this event? And is there perhaps a way to tell a better story about your life? Our Bible passage for today comes from the book of Psalms, chapter 55. Psalm 55, if you're looking at one of the Bibles that we have in the pews, that's on page 522. Now, the key verses of the Psalm are verses 4 through 8, but we're going to read the whole thing. Now, the Psalms are these ancient poems from ancient Israel written in the Hebrew language. And Psalm 55 is a prayer to God written by a person who seems to be involved in politics or city affairs of some sort. And he's been betrayed by a close friend. Enemies are everywhere. Everywhere he turns, he sees corruption in plots and violence. Now, based on everything we've discussed so far about trauma, what causes it, what the symptoms can be, see if you can pick out some signs of trauma here. But more importantly, notice how this writer copes with what he's going through. So this is Psalm 55, starting in verse 1. Give ear to my prayer, O God. Do not hide yourself from my supplication. Attend to me and answer me. I am troubled in my complaint. I am distraught by the noise of the enemy because of the clamor of the wicked. For they bring trouble upon me, and in anger they bear a grudge against me. My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling come upon me, and horror overwhelms me. And I say, oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. Truly, I would flee far away. I would lodge in the wilderness. I would hurry to find shelter for myself from the raging wind and tempest. Confuse, O Lord, confound their speech. For I see violence and strife in the city. Day and night they go around it on its walls, and iniquity and trouble are within it. Ruin is in its midst. Oppression and fraud do not depart from the marketplace. It is not enemies who taunt me. I could bear that. It is not adversaries who deal insolently with me. I could hide from them, but it is you, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend, with whom I kept pleasant company. We walked in the house of God with the throng. Let death come upon them. Let them go down alive to Sheol, for evil is in their homes and in their hearts. But I call upon God, and the Lord will save me. Evening and morning and at noon I utter my complaint and moan, and he will hear my voice. He will redeem me unharmed from the battle that I wage, for many are arrayed against me. God, who is enthroned from of old, will hear and will humble them, because they do not change and do not fear God. My companion laid hands on a friend and violated a covenant with me, with speech smoother than butter, but with a heart set on war, with words that were softer than oil, but in fact were drawn swords. Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved, but you, O God, will cast them down into the lowest pit. The bloodthirsty and treacherous shall not live out half their days. But I will trust in you. Whatever's happening to this psalmist, he's under intense distress. Just think about some of the phrases that he used, how bodily it is. Trembling, horror, the terrors of death are upon me. There's anguish in his heart. He feels it in his chest. And he just wants to fly away from it all. Have you ever felt that? Your life feels so out of control that all you can think of to do is just run away from everything. And he seems to fear for his life. And some of the references to violence here are metaphorical, like words smoother than butter, but are actually drawn swords. That's a metaphor, but some of the violent references are definitely not metaphors. He says at one point, I see violence and strife in the city. And then the most visceral is his friend who betrayed him. He says, my companion laid hands upon a friend. In other words, one dear friend betrayed another and hurt the other friend. And yet some of what this writer says is pretty intense. He asks God to punish his enemies, which is, again, it's a lot. Some intense emotion. But at the same time, if these people are promoting violence and corruption and injustice in his community, really all he's asking God to do is give them their comeuppance. It's not wrong for people who do evil to be brought to justice. It's not a wrong thing to want at all. And notice that he doesn't say, God, I'm going after them. He puts it in God's hands and trusts God to take care of them. When this psalmist is at the end of his rope, he trusts God for help. Now, not all of us have big T traumas. Big traumas, the kinds of things that can develop into post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, some of us probably do, but not all of us. But everyone has smaller traumas, little t traumas. These are memories that we'll never forget, things that are burned into our minds, but that aren't debilitating. They don't affect our day-to-day functioning. But what happens when we do have something big? Something that leaves a mark, that stays with us for years and years. Processing trauma can be one of the most difficult and painful things a person can go through. It's like opening up an infected wound and cleaning it out. It hurts, but it's a whole lot better in the end to clean out the wound than to just continue to let it fester. But how can we take steps towards healing from trauma that we've experienced? So in our last little bit, just some practical tips for dealing with trauma in your own life and for understanding people in your life who have been through things like this. And just a preliminary piece of advice is that if you feel stuck, there's nothing wrong with seeking help professionally. And there are therapists and clinicians, people who are trained to help people walk through really layered and difficult traumatic events. And there's no shame in getting some extra support. So if you feel stuck, nothing wrong with seeking help. But the first step in finding a sense of healing from trauma, it's really simple. It's just talking about what happened. Put it into words. Our psalmist opened up to God. He poured his heart out to God, wrote this entire song about his experiences. He took time and attention into putting words to it. And clearly, he didn't just pour it out to God. He didn't keep it to himself, because if he had kept it all to himself, we wouldn't know anything about it. He shared it with other people. So talk about your experience, because just ignoring it forever won't help. So find someone you trust that you can talk with. Don't be afraid to share it in bits and pieces. And as you do, make sure the other person is okay with you sharing these things. Make sure that they're going to be able to handle what you're telling them. But at the same time, it's about making a connection with another person, right? Supporting each other, showing love to each other as you talk about what you've been through. And that love that we share can make all the difference. So talk about what happened. But the second step is to identify what your trauma led you to believe about yourself or about the world. Our psalmist's experience of betrayal and violence from one friend to another made him feel deeply, deeply unsafe in his everyday life. If he didn't lock his door at night, he certainly is now, and he's probably looking over his shoulder as he walks through the marketplace. And maybe he was just being paranoid. That's always a possibility, but maybe not. And that's just it. Sometimes the beliefs that we carry from trauma are rational. The world can be dangerous. People can be evil and cruel. Relationships can end very poorly. It's not wrong or foolish to believe these sorts of things, but it's no way to live. It's no way to live. And that's our third step. Once you've identified what beliefs you carry, tell a better story about yourself and about the world you live in. Take that negative story, those negative thoughts, and as much as you can, replace them with something more positive. See, our psalmist is struggling. He's experiencing a lot of really intense symptoms, but ultimately he pulls through his experience because he lets his faith guide him. Cast your burden on the Lord, he writes, and he will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved, but you, O God, will cast them down. See, even with all the terrible things happening around him, things that could very easily drive him to despair, he chooses to believe that goodness will prevail. in the end. He chooses to believe that in spite of what happened to him, God can be trusted. He chooses a better story. And you might be tempted to say, sure, but that's naive. That's so naive, because sometimes the bad guys win, and sometimes the good guys lose. Sometimes things just don't work out, and if you say that, you'd be right. But again, that mindset of cynicism and fear, it's not foolish, but it's no way to live. And just like in our psalm, our faith gives us resources to write a better story for ourselves. You feel like you're a broken person because of what happened to you? Well, guess what? God chooses broken people. God works through broken people. God used a man whose body was broken on a cross to mend the brokenness at the heart of human existence. And God's love and grace remind us that we are not what happened to us. We're God's children, chosen and loved. And we can look with hope to the day when Scripture says God will wipe every tear from our eyes and there will be no more death or mourning, crying, or pain, for all of that has passed. Jesus, God, helps us tell a better story than our trauma wants us to believe. Easy, right? No. It takes hard work to heal. It can be slow. It can sometimes take years of processing to have the breakthrough that you're looking through. But God's with us every step of the way. Jesus is called the great physician, the great healer. And that includes mental health. So I'll leave you with a quote from my wife. As we were talking last week about some of her experiences as a therapist, just what it means to process through trauma and to heal from it. She said that healing doesn't mean I forget about what happens to me. It means I don't let it have power over me. Healing doesn't mean I forget about what happened. It means I don't let it have power over me. So take heart this morning, because we serve a God who is above all, and a Savior who walks with us through all that we go through. A God who is a healer and can heal you.